The sun didn't shine that day. It scorched, it blistered, it boiled the skin of the living and baked the dead into silence. In the heart of Famagusta's broken square, Marcantonio Bragadin stood bound to a post, his once gilded armor reduced to filthy scraps, his face swollen from days of beating. A silence rippled through the crowd, not out of respect but dread. Even the air recoiled. A long knife was drawn slowly, lovingly, like a holy relic unsheathed before a sacred rite. He didn't scream when it touched his skin. He only exhaled as if his body, stripped of dignity and rank, had finally accepted what was coming. Sweat mixed with blood before the blade had even begun. His eyes, pale and sunken, drifted up to the heavens, but there were no angels. Just clouds that refused to cry. The first cut wasn't deep. It wasn't meant to be. It was deliberate, reverent. A line drawn not for pain but for memory, and memory would not forget this death. They tell it like a military footnote, that Bragadin was a Venetian commander who died at the hands of the Ottomans after a failed siege. They whisper of miscommunication, of a treaty broken, of unfortunate reprisals. They call it a consequence of war, a retaliation, an anomaly, but the truth was Flayed and buried with his body, desecrated and sewn into Turkish mockery. What they never tell you is that Bragadin surrendered in good faith, that the keys to Famagusta were handed over with trembling fingers, not arrogance, that he had held the city far beyond reason, outnumbered 20-1, long after hope had rotted in the bones of his men. They don't tell you that Lala Mustafa Pasha, the Ottoman commander, swore by Allah and empire that Bragadin and his men would be spared, that those terms were written and then incinerated in the very fire that consumed his flesh. They tell you he was proud, that he provoked his fate. But how could pride survive weeks of siege, starvation, and cannibalism among the rubble of a Christian city isolated by sea and abandoned by Rome? They don't speak of the betrayal not just by the Ottomans, but by his own empire. Venice had long seen Cyprus as expendable, a chess piece between greater ambitions. Bragadin was sent to delay the inevitable, not to survive it. His resistance became an inconvenience, his loyalty an embarrassment. And when his skin was finally peeled from his body, it was not just a punishment by his enemies. It was an erasure agreed upon in silence by those who preferred he vanish as a martyr, not a reminder. They sold you the myth of war, of glorious defeat, of heroism forged in noble struggle. But Marcantonio Bragadin did not die like a hero. He died like a message, a warning carved from bone. He was not born for glory. Marcantonio Bragadin entered the world in Venice's cold stone halls of privilege, but not majesty. His family held status, yes, old nobility, but they were not rulers. They were stewards, statesmen, caretakers of empire in a city where power flowed like ink through parchment, carefully measured and brutally negotiated. Venice was a city of masks, of marble hiding rot, of silent assassinations and golden decrees. To rise through it required not just talent but patience, a patience that Bragadin learned from watching courtrooms instead of battlefields. He was trained in law, not war. He studied treaties, not swords. But fate, or perhaps failure, has a way of sculpting unlikely defenders. Cyprus had long been a jewel claimed by many hands. For decades it had belonged to Venice, an island fortress, a trade route, a gateway to the east. But it was a thorn in the side of the Ottoman Empire, whose borders pressed like a noose against the Mediterranean. When whispers came of war, the Doge and Senate did not send their greatest general. They sent Bragadin a lawyer, a diplomat, a man known more for negotiation than steel. Why? Because Cyprus, though valuable, was already half lost. What they needed was a man who could buy time. When Bragadin arrived in Famagusta, the heat was already unbearable. The city bristled with decay and fear, its Venetian walls worn thin from neglect. He inherited a garrison of tired soldiers, a population starved of hope and defenses that looked strong only from a distance. Yet he did not flinch. He walked the ramparts each dawn, inspected the rusted cannons, and called council meetings in the echoing halls of ruined chapels. His presence alone steadied the city. He believed fiercely that survival was a choice, and that if Rome would not save them, they would become Rome. When the Ottomans came, they came not with noise but thunder. In July 1570, an army of over 100,000 men landed on Cyprus under the command of Lala Mustafa Pasha. Nicosia fell swiftly. Bragadin knew Famagusta would be next. He sent word to Venice for reinforcements, for mercy, for anything but silence returned. So he began preparing the city not for victory but for siege. For 11 months the city bled. The Ottomans encircled Famagusta, digging trenches, building towers, bringing in cannon that cracked the air like thunder. Day after day they launched fire and lead at its walls. But Bragadin refused surrender. He orchestrated raids in the dead of night. He inspired the women and children to carry water, to bury the dead, to sing hymns as bombs fell. Disease spread like smoke. Food became ash. The dead were buried in shallow pits, then dug up again and burned when space ran out. Bragadin did not sleep. He walked barefoot through the rubble, handing out salt, binding wounds, carrying stones. His beard grew long, his robes stained with blood. His soldiers called him the Lion of Famagusta. But even lions grow tired. By the summer of 1571, the city had nothing left to burn. The walls were cracked, the wells were dry. Men chewed leather to stay alive. And still, Bragadin would not bend. The Ottomans, perhaps out of respect, perhaps boredom, offered terms: amnesty, safe passage, protection for civilians. Bragadin agreed. He kissed the Koran in ceremony. He handed over the keys, and he walked into the enemy camp with a small escort, believing in the sanctity of oaths. He did not return. Because his resistance had humiliated an empire, because Venetian pirates had violated truce elsewhere, because oaths in war are parchment in flame. Marcantonio Bragadin's rise to power was not through politics, not through bloodlines or royal decrees. It came in fire, in starvation, in hymns sung by children beneath shattered glass. He became powerful because he refused to die quietly. And that power would cost him his skin. It began with ceremony, as all betrayals do. On August 5th, 1571, the gates of Famagusta groaned open for the last time. Bragadin walked out slowly, draped in tattered robes, holding the treaty in one hand and the sacred Quran in the other, a symbol of peace, of mutual honor. Around him, the last defenders of the city limped forward, hollow-eyed, dragging what remained of their dignity across the dirt. The Ottomans waited with drums and silence, their ranks gleaming with gold and steel. Lala Mustafa Pasha stepped forward, his face unreadable beneath his turbaned crown. He accepted the keys. He smiled, and then the trap was sprung. There was no gunshot, no scream, just a shift in the air, a tension so sudden it cracked reality. One of Bragadin's officers was seized, another was struck down. The soldiers who had surrendered under truce were bound, beaten, dragged away. Bragadin raised his hands in protest, reminded them of the treaty, the oath, the Quran, but the Quran was knocked from his hands. The treaty was torn in two, his words drowned beneath laughter. They accused him of sacrilege, of murdering Turkish envoys during the siege, of crimes neither proven nor relevant. But it was not justice they sought, it was vengeance. Ottoman spies had brought word of Venetian atrocities elsewhere, of a massacre in Nicosia, of a pirate raid on a Turkish convoy. The empire needed blood, And Bragadin, the face of resistance, the one who had humiliated them for 11 long months, became the altar. They imprisoned him first, not in a cell but in a tent reeking of sweat and wet hemp. He was stripped, shackled, and spat upon. His beard was torn from his face by hand, his nose severed, his ears sliced off one by one, each with the same deliberation that a butcher gives to his trade. But these were only preludes. The music of cruelty had not yet reached its crescendo. For 13 days he was paraded through the camp like a cursed relic. Children were made to mock him, soldiers pissed on his wounds, and still he stood. He did not beg. He did not curse. He did not break. That, more than anything, enraged them. On the 14th day he was led to the square. The people of Famagusta, what remained of them, were forced to watch. No trial was held, no sentence read. The punishment had already been decided. It would not be hanging, it would not be the sword. It would be something slower, something unforgettable. Because when an empire bleeds, it demands not just victory but memory. And Marcantonio Bragadin, once a lawyer of quiet words, was about to become history's most vivid warning. The sky over Famagusta did not mourn. It burned white-hot and pitiless. The air had no wind, only stillness, thick as spoiled wine. A silence fell, not of reverence but of anticipation. A silence that swallowed even the birds. They had gathered at the square not for justice but for spectacle. And in the center, beneath a crooked red banner, stood a post, wooden, splintered, stained from older rituals long forgotten. Now rebaptized. They brought him forth with no fanfare, just the scrape of chains and the slow drum of leathered boots against stone. Marcantonio Bragadin no longer resembled the man who had once ruled a city. His frame, stripped of armor, had become a canvas of bruises and sunburn. His beard was gone. His hands hung limp, bound behind his back, yet his eyes, swollen and cracked with salt, still held their shape. Still looked outward, not pleading, not defiant, just present. They made him kneel. A rope was looped around his waist, not tight, just enough to say, "You cannot run, though you've already stopped walking." A soldier read from a parchment, but no one listened, not even him. Words, once his greatest weapon, had failed. There was nothing left but flesh and time. The executioner approached slowly. He did not wear black. He wore red, the color of honor, of duty, of final acts. In his hands was not a blade, but a long iron tool. Dull, blunt, it gleamed not with polish, but with memory. No words were exchanged. This was not a moment for conversation. When the ritual began, there was no scream, just a breath, a long, slow exhale, as though Bragadin were offering his body to the wind. The first motion was not cutting, but outlining, the way a sculptor marks marble before the strike. The crowd leaned in. Some turned away, others stared, unblinking. There was no haste. The process was not designed for death, but for unraveling. Each gesture deliberate, like a priest cleansing sin from cloth. Bragadin's posture shifted, spine arching under invisible weight, but he did not fall. The sun bore down like judgment, yet he remained upright, bound to pain, not as victim but as witness. The people wept silently. Children clung to their mothers. Some Ottoman soldiers looked away, others cheered. The square echoed not with cries, but with breath, a symphony of gasps, of choked sobs, of footsteps nervously shifting. And beneath it all, the scraping sound, dry and rhythmic, continued. His skin became a shroud he was being slowly lifted out of. Not torn, not hacked, but peeled as if the body were shedding its final illusion. Time stopped meaning anything. Minutes bled into hours. Shadows lengthened and crawled up the walls. The executioner did not tire. He was performing history. Still, Bragadin did not cry out. His lips moved once to pray or curse or simply remember his name. No one heard the words, but everyone felt them. At last, when the ritual ended, when the final veil of skin had been removed, the body crumpled, not like a man falling, but like a flag being lowered. He was gone before he touched the earth, not in death, but in surrender to something older than pain. And still the violence was not complete. His body was filled with straw, dressed in Venetian robes, hoisted on a donkey and paraded through the camp like a grotesque marionette. A puppet of power undone. They laughed, they spit, they sang songs mocking the lion of St. Mark. They showed the world what happens when defiance blooms too long. Later, the effigy was hung from a mast and sailed back to Constantinople as a trophy. Venice did not speak. The city of masks remained silent. But in the churches of Cyprus, candles were lit, in secret, in shame, in awe, not for the war, not for the dead, but for the memory of a man who stood too long, and whose silence in the end spoke louder than the blade. The square in Famagusta was hosed clean, the post dismantled, the blood-streaked stones swept as if death could be erased by dust and water, but the echo lingered in the air, in the bone chill of survivors, in the way the wind refused to move across the ruined city for days. Bragadin was gone, but not absent. His body, now a sack of straw wearing the likeness of Venetian dignity, became an icon of humiliation. The Ottomans had won the siege, but in mocking him they made him immortal. Venice, when the news arrived, did not wail. The Doge issued no statement. The Senate convened, eyes downcast, lips pursed in the cold elegance of state. There were whispers, of course, that Bragadin had been abandoned, that his stand had been valiant but politically costly, that his death, grotesque as it was, offered an opportunity to stoke public rage and thus justify a larger war. And so it became useful. His martyrdom was painted in oil and ink, spread through back streets and basilicas. Artists imagined his torment in candlelit detail. Priests compared him to Christ. Mothers told his story to their children with lowered voices. The Lion of Famagusta became a symbol not of victory but of defiance, a man torn apart because he refused to kneel. But symbols are dangerous things. They gather power like embers under ash. Venice retaliated, not immediately but decisively. The Holy League, fueled by outrage and the winds of vengeance, launched a campaign that culminated in the Battle of Lepanto. There, in October of the same year, the Ottoman fleet suffered a devastating loss. It was one of the bloodiest naval battles in history. Thousands died, empires trembled, and though Bragadin's name was not spoken from the decks, his absence was felt like a hand pressed to every soldier's spine. But no war could reclaim his body. For years his skin remained in Constantinople a grotesque trophy, stuffed and hung, displayed and mocked in hushed circles of the palace. It was not until 1580, nearly a decade later, that Venetian spies, masked as merchants, stole it back. They wrapped it in silks, smuggled it by sea and brought it home, not as flesh, but as relic. The skin of Marcantonio Bragadin was buried with ceremony in the church of Santi Giovanni e Paolo, beneath a tomb that bore his name, not his title. The people mourned, quietly, deeply, not for the man alone, but for what he had revealed. That treaties can be burned, that silence can be louder than surrender, that a body once torn from itself can still return not whole, not healed, but remembered. And in memory he became more than what they flayed. He became what they feared, an idea. History does not remember skin, it remembers silence, the silence that follows a scream so deep it folds the world around it. Marcantonio Bragadin was not the first to die in betrayal, nor the last to be consumed by empire. But something in the way he died, the way he did not look away, the way he stood beneath the knife as if bearing witness for all those who could not transform him into more than a man. He became a rift, a scar across the map of war. And for centuries after, his name would be whispered not just in Venice, but in the chambers of generals, the nightmares of diplomats, and the secret prayers of soldiers forced to choose between dignity and breath. They built a statue in his honor, tall, noble, arm raised as if commanding winds to stop. But no statue could contain what he became. It is not his likeness that survives. It is the ritual, the betrayal, the fact that empires, even those draped in faith, will break their word when pride is wounded deep enough. That oaths are only sacred until blood is spilled. And the church, too, stood silent, perhaps out of shame, perhaps fear, perhaps because they, like Venice, had left him to die while they plotted elsewhere. And yet they invoked his name in sermons. They held masses in his memory. They told their followers to be brave like Bragadin, as if courage were not the very thing they punished. What remains of him now lies in a marble tomb, its stone polished and cold, watched over by candles that flicker against ancient walls. But his body is not what matters, it never was. What matters is that for one man, silence became defiance, and that defiance became legend. His story is not one of triumph. It is not even one of justice. It is a reminder that men can be torn apart, flayed by empire, humiliated before the crowd, and still win. Not by surviving, but by refusing to disappear, because the body was gone. But the echo of his scream never left the stone. Not by surviving, but by refusing to disappear, because the body was gone. But the echo of his scream never left the stone.